Okay, my mic is on. Everyone has their coffee, their last coffee burst they're going to need for HSF 2024. Thank you so much to those of you who've made it here to the end with us, and those of us joining on live stream as well, which I have done for part of this conference. And I think it's fitting that we are wrapping up this year with what is now the absolute crown of NATO and of European security, this now solid stretch of allies across the top of the alliance. With the inclusion of Finland and Sweden, of course, now NATO has an opportunity to incredibly increase security across the Arctic at the same time as environmental degradation and the increasing cooperation between Russia and China, of course, also increase insecurity on the other side. So I'm very happy to be hosting this final panel here this year. I am Teri Schultz. I'm a journalist who's been covering NATO and the European Union in Brussels for many years. But as I always say at HSF, I got my start here just out of university as a journalist here in Helsinki, and I have my master's from University of Helsinki. So I'm very tuned into the Nordic country. On totta. And so anyway, I love hosting this panel, and I'm very happy to introduce my fellow panelists here. We're going to start with Särkkä. She is probably well known to most people here, a senior research fellow at FIIA. Alex Dalziel, a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier-Institute in Ottawa. Greg Pollock, principal director for Arctic and Global Resilience Policy in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And Masatoshi Murakami, he is associate professor at Kogakkan University in Ise, Japan.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well, it's pronounced like Finnish a lot in Japanese, so
yeah, that's right.
Easy to manage. So thank you very much to all of you for being here. And we're going to start with the sweet spot. Starting with Finnish and Swedish inclusion in NATO, Eero. This, of course, as I mentioned, this completes the defense across the top of the alliance, and this is something that you focus on, and it's increasingly important. Of course, it comes just at the time that SHAPE and Sakur Kavoli has revamped regional plans, so it is the appropriate time to talk about this, the Arctic as a region which increasingly needs the deterrence and defense of NATO. So why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Thank you, Teri. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, it's really honored to be in this expert panel this morning. I'd like to start by saying that, in my view, NATO is currently at a critical conjuncture when it comes between balancing different security threats and challenges, Russia and China, different geopolitical domains and environments, and Arctic is certainly one of them. So the Nordic enlargement, I would argue, is really a game changer in this regard because it shifts the center of gravity from NATO's southern and central flanks also to the northern flank and northeastern flank, which during the post-Cold War period was very much often forgotten flank, unfortunately. So I'd like to ask, is NATO doing enough in this regard at the moment? I think the process has begun, but a lot more could be done, and is being actually done as we speak today. But if you just look at the NATO strategic concept from 2022, as well as the following Vilnius and Washington summit declarations, there's actually very little focus on the High North. There's actually only one paragraph in each of these documents that actually addresses High North.
Oh, yes. I should have known that already.
Yes, so I actually did some qualitative content analysis as a researcher, so I noticed that. But like I said, a lot is being done as we speak now. Finland just popped up the news last week that we will host NATO's forward land forces in Sodankylä, in the Arctic Lapland, and the
with
Sweden.
Swedish as the
as the framework nation, which is brilliant. And also a few days ago we got the news that we will have the Land Component Command in Mikkeli in the South Karelia region. So I think really this is a game changer because Finland and Sweden will bring the space to NATO. I think that's the number one thing. We will bring the land space and the airspace to NATO, and I think we should understand the Arctic as a region that encompasses from the Arctic Ocean all the way to the southern bits of the Baltic Sea. And in this, obviously, the Arctic 7 have a lot to do, the NATO's Nordic countries, United States and Canada, but I think we should also engage the Arctic, other stakeholders in the region, as well as in the Indo-Pacific, which I'm sure we're going to hear about more today. So what will Finland bring to this equation, in addition to the land space? I think the focus will change now from the maritime domain also to the air domain and the land domain. So when you think of this land component command that we have there in Mikkeli, we bring a great deal of know-how, how to conduct land operations and how to plan those land operations as well in these extremely harsh, cold conditions and dark as well. So I think that is one of the really important key aspects that Finland will bring the capabilities, the Arctic capabilities into NATO, but not only the material capabilities, all the different aspects of the capability, whether it's doctrinal, organizational, training, exercises, the know-how, how to survive in these extremely cold Arctic conditions. So I would call all the NATO Arctic countries really to increase the Arctic IQ now inside the alliance.
Oh, that's a good phrase, Arctic IQ. We can take that. And we should point out that there have been these exercises even before Finland and Sweden joined. The US has always sent its soldiers to these countries to train in these conditions that are hard to replicate anywhere else, right?
Right, that's correct.
Thankfully. They're hard to replicate. Okay, that's a great start from the Finnish perspective, Alex. So you're a specialist on the Russia-China nexus, and the Arctic is one of the most interesting aspects that we could now talk about, of course. The environmental aspects of this make this kind of cooperation between Russia and China even more significant, as if the politics didn't already help create that cooperation, right? So I'm really interested, and I think everyone is interested in hearing about what you think is happening right now and what we're likely to see in the near future as Russia and China draw closer together.
Thank you, Teri, and thank you to the organizers of HSF for having me here. So, the China-Russia relationship in the Arctic is a subcomponent of the larger relationship, and basically the Ukraine crisis has thrown accelerant on that, both in 2014 and then in 2022. Shifting from a situation where Russia had already had plans to kind of tap more into the Indo-Pacific and relations with China. 2014, it started to accelerate those to build up its resilience, and really in 2022, we saw Russia having to shift to China out of necessity, given the loss of European markets and sanctions, etc. So this has given China new opportunities in the Arctic, and this has to be set against China's overall problems, again, as kind of a function of its relationship with the USA, with the European Union, where its opportunities in the rest of the Arctic have shriveled. So China is very determined to have a polar presence. That's at both the North and South poles. And now Russia is really the best and to some extent only way that it can do this. So it finds Russia as we're aware, in a strategically weak position on this. Some of Russia's long strategic concerns about more or less managing China in the Arctic, while I still think they're there, Russia clearly has a much weaker hand to deal with. So if Russia wants to get to the Asian markets, the Northern Sea route, the Arctic, are extremely important parts of that. And I think we're seeing in terms of some of the development, particularly on the sea lane, we know the problems in the Panama Canal because of climate change, the Red Sea because of the Houthis and instability in the Middle East, China's long-term concerns about the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, that their risk quotient on running through here and kind of testing proof of concept, although I think we're past that now, is there. So we see a few factors pushing China's attention north. I think we don't want to underestimate, you'll hear a lot, and I think this is where I try to emphasize quite a bit, is that people will bring up the factors about why this won't work. And there are, the China-Russia relationship is not defined by trust, it's not defined by mutual amicability, it's defined by interests and necessity. For Russia, the Arctic is extremely important. For China, much less. That gives it latitude. But if it wants to be in the north, it needs Russia. So I think we're going to see if, for geopolitical competition with the United States, it's a benefit for China to be in the north. It's a benefit for China to have Russia locked down as an ally and subordinate, so it kind of has its northern flank covered. And as we're looking at China and its continued attempt to remain the dominant player in critical minerals, rare earth elements, the construction of the manufacture of decarbonized fuel sources, making sure that it has privileged access, preferably at a discount to the Russian Arctic, which is increasingly the focus of Russian economic development, is the north of its country for its mineral and energy resource development. So maybe I can just throw that out there. There's a few things we can pick up.
For sure.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing there is then also the pressure on China to reduce its support for Russia in other aspects, in sort of dual-use items. What I'm hearing here is that's one less reason why China would cut off Russia. If you're saying if they're so dependent on them to increase their Arctic capacity, then they're even less likely to respond to Western pressure.
I think it's one more reason.
Cut back the relationship. Interesting.
Yes, for sure. I think it's one more
As if we
reason.
need more.
The Chinese have some scholars will point to the wait and see approach in the Arctic. They're hoping opportunities in Northern Europe, in Greenland, and Northern Canada, potentially even Alaska someday come back. Right now they have Russia. I do think it's important to think that this is not the main consideration. The competition with the United States of America is the main issue for China in its support to Russia. But this is one way they manage that relationship with the Russians.
Which is a fine transition into Greg, right? So Greg, I mean, you can pick up on China if you like, but one of the things that we wanted to mention here is that we are very lucky to have the newly appointed ambassador for the Arctic here somewhere, we think. Mike Frege?
Yep.
Is he here?
Yep,
Oh.
our new Arctic ambassador there in the corner of the room there.
Hi, I didn't get to meet you. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you here. Feel free to pop in any time here if you'd like to say something. Otherwise, Greg, so we, the NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg used to say frequently, I mean, I haven't heard it that recently, but that despite things going badly in other aspects of the US-Russian relationship, the NATO-Russian relationship, in the Arctic, at least things are still stable, right? The things that Russia cooperated with the West on were not deteriorating as quickly as everything else. But these were kind of low-hanging fruit, search and rescue operations, de-risking, and I'm putting it all on you. I mean, you don't have to speak for NATO, but is this still the case? The US has a new Arctic strategy out as of the summer. How much does what you've heard here so far, how much is that reflected in the new US strategy? Are you taking all of this into consideration? Is there more than, obviously, more than was handled by the NATO statement in Vilnius? I'm handing you a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take it from there. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to begin with my thanks to FIIA and my Finnish counterparts here in the Finnish government for all of the hospitality and engagement these last few days. Every individual I've engaged with here in Helsinki has been helpful and hospitable and kind, and it's been a pleasure to be here. As you noted, it's a special pleasure for me to be here at this moment where we have just had our Senate confirm our first Arctic ambassador, and it's going to be, I think, a joy for me from the Pentagon side to work very closely with Dr. Mike Frege and his team in the State Department. Mike brings tremendous experience and relationships across the Arctic, and so I'm very much looking forward to sort of taking our engagement on Arctic issues to a next level. There's something poetic about our last panel focusing on the Central Command area of responsibility, where so much of the Department of Defense has been engaged for the last few decades and remains so to a meaningful degree, but also to see this kind of pivot to the high north in some sense. As you noted, we do have a new U.S. Department of Defense strategy for the Arctic, which I would commend to all of you if you haven't gotten a chance to see it. I think Mike's appointment and confirmation, as well as this new strategy, reflects a growing U.S. and defense focus on the Arctic region. And there are some important reasons for that, of course. We've seen profound changes in the Arctic over the last several years, beginning with the geophysical changes happening in the Arctic as a result of climate change. And that means that sea lines of communication across the Arctic are going to become more open and available for both commercial traffic as well as conceivably for militaries over time here. And so we need to be thinking about the implications of all that. Of course, on the geopolitical front, we're in a very different place than we were even 5 years ago with respect to the West's relationship with Russia. I think we've certainly thrashed through that to a meaningful degree here over the last couple of days, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that more in the panel. Likewise, we see a more active China in the Arctic. It's notable to me that this past summer, the Shuilong 2, the Snow Dragon 2, was the first time a Chinese naval vessel, vessel paid call at Murmansk. And so we are seeing that kind of operational engagement between Russia and China that we monitor very closely being made manifest in some degree in the Arctic. And then we have, of course, the historic decisions by Helsinki and Stockholm to join NATO. And that brings a great deal of clarity so that we now have 7 of the 8 Arctic states all within NATO. And so I think your question began with a kind of high-level look at the state of cooperation in the Arctic. I think there are some who would look at matters in the Arctic Council, for example, which does not deal with security matters, and say Arctic cooperation is deteriorating in some degree. And I think that that's what's gone on in the Arctic Council. Norway's done a tremendous job, I think, managing those dynamics. But that's a reflection of the impossibility of real collaboration with Russian counterparts, even on science matters at this point in time as a result of its actions in Ukraine.
But we should point out that the Arctic Council suspended its normal operations because of Russia after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the Arctic Council is not meeting in its normal
It's
format
not meeting,
since then.
but it is continuing certain important, I think, lines of effort. So I don't think there's any intent to close up shop in the Arctic Council. That remains a very important diplomatic forum and a mechanism for some low-level engagement. But yes, clearly we are not carrying on anything like business as usual. But I think the point I want to make here is that while that's one framing, I think an alternative framing is that at least on the security side in particular, engagement across the Arctic is at an all-time high. And there's a tremendous degree of alignment across what we call the Arctic 7. And so obviously bringing Sweden and Finland into NATO was an important part of that. We also see, I think, growing collaboration in a variety of fora across the Arctic 7, even beyond NATO. Of course, NORDEFCO is an important mechanism here in the Nordic states for collaboration. So while the Arctic Council is not fully functioning at this time, we do see, I think, a tremendous amount of shared values, shared interests, and a tremendous amount of capability up here in the high north. And we're looking forward to deepening that as we go about implementing our new strategy, enhancing our capabilities with our allies and partners, exercising presence in the Arctic, and really kind of deepening our ongoing connections with Arctic allies.
Do you think Russia feels like it lost anything in the Arctic Council, suspending it from participation? I mean, was this one of the places where they really protested that they should be allowed to continue some of these, some of the projects and the programs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to speak too deeply on matters related to the Arctic Council because, as I say, that's a diplomatic forum. I think the Russians at times have used the promise of engagement, thinking that could entice us to not take the steps that I think are now being taken across the Arctic 7 in terms of building up our deterrence capabilities. So I think it was an appropriate decision to sort of limit the engagement with Russia, of course, as a result of its actions in Ukraine and elsewhere, frankly. So something is clearly lost in that respect. It is unfortunate that the Arctic Council isn't able to continue its important work. But I think we're being clear-eyed about the fact that that cannot be, the Russians cannot sort of hold hostage Arctic Council engagement in the hopes that the rest of the Arctic 7 won't invest in their own defense and deterrence capabilities in the Arctic.
Because this was one of the examples that was always, given that at least in the Arctic Council we can still talk about other important things, but they may have been whitewashing their behavior. So I don't know, I'm not going to try to editorialize on that so much. I will let Masatoshi come in with your perspective. Japan does not declare itself a near Arctic power, a near Arctic state, unlike China. Mm-hmm. So how does it feel to be watching these developments? You have had some quite interesting posts in China, in Taiwan. So you've been very close to Chinese thinking on the Arctic. So I'm really interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Teri, and other colleagues on the stage. And personally, I'm very grateful for FIIA, who is arranging this precious opportunity. And personally, I'm very happy to come back to Finland. I mean, 2 years ago, I was researching at the Finnish university in Tampere University. So that's why I'm very happy right now. And in general, Japan and NATO are advancing our cooperation with each other, especially Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I mean, so Japan is the biggest supporter for Ukraine outside the NATO, and we are financially supporting Ukraine, of course, and we are offering the defense materials as well. So, and mainly because we are having 3 potential adversaries around Japan. So I used to be working within the Japanese government, but anymore, so I have kind of freedom of speech, so I can say that. So,
And if I can just say how remarkable it is that you can sit here and talk about the support that Japan is giving to Ukraine, because when the Ukraine Defense Contact Group was first set up, people didn't want to talk about that. But I had conversations like this with your ambassador last night, and the fact that you can mention it
he's
openly.
here.
And I mean, this itself is a remarkable change from even 2 years ago, when almost 3 years ago when the war started.
Yeah, and we are very, very keen to support Ukraine because Ukraine is our neighbor's neighbor. So I mean, so our neighbor is Russia, of course, and neighbor's neighbor is Ukraine. And our northern territory is illegally occupied Russia, of course, northern territories. So, and that's why we are very keen to cooperate with Finland, NATO, and European countries. And we have 3 potential adversaries, namely Russia, China, and North Korea. And 3 are all intimate threat to Japanese security. And that's why we like to cooperate with NATO. And regarding the Arctic, so, to be honest, we started to have our ambassador for Arctic issue from the year 2013, maybe earlier than the US. I'm sorry to say that. But, anyway, but so as Teri said, so we are not the Arctic country, but we are observer on the Arctic Council as well. And so we are the closest country geographically to the Arctic. So we have a very large expectations to the Arctic, and if it is governed by the international order, the present international order by the Japan, Europe, and the US, it could be the nice corridor between Japan and the European countries.
Was it annoying when China said it was a near Arctic state?
Yeah, but anyway, we have very great interest in the Arctic as well, and we'd like to contribute to the stability of the Arctic issue as well as a powerhouse for technology. So everybody knows that, so Japan is a powerhouse for technology. For instance, we are the 3rd largest country in terms of shipbuilding, and maybe we can contribute to the ice breaking as well. So And
you're in the right country now to talk about that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so we can cooperate in many ways, I think.
So I want to give my panelists a chance to come in on anything each other have said before I bring up a new set of questions. Would anybody like to respond to any comments? No, Iro, you started.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking about the Arctic Council. I mean, when it comes to the questions of...
I wouldn't even know about it if I hadn't lived in Finland, to be honest. I wouldn't focus that much on it, but it was important here.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the questions of hard security and military security, I mean, I think it's really important to point out that the Arctic Council never addressed those questions. I mean, they fell outside the jurisdiction of the Arctic Council. The same applied to the Barents Arctic Council as well, which is now suspended as well. So I think the Arctic 7, the Nordic countries, Canada, and the United States really have to take matters in their own hands inside NATO to make sure that we plan the necessary defense posture in the High North without aggravating the situation, but making sure that each inch of our territory, whether it's in the land, sea, or air, or even in cyber and space, is protected. So I'm kind of calling here, for a sort of deterrence by denial posture.
But those things that were taken up, Greg, I mean, what happened to the search and rescue functions that were still working correctly? I mean, are those now a risk, another risk?
I think there's always risk when it comes to operating in the extreme conditions in the Arctic. I think, there are still basic norms around, coming to the aid of fellow mariners in extremist situations. But, I do want to pick up the point that Eero made around the fact that I think the Arctic Council is necessary but not sufficient when it comes to protecting the interests of the Arctic 7. And that work is really underway in terms of what Eero has described, to build those mechanisms to ensure that we are developing the capabilities together as well as the connectivity. The fact that the United States has agreed with Sweden and Finland independently here, new defense cooperation agreements that will enable more exercising, more presence, more engagement. I think that's what we're going to see more and more of. We heard just a few moments ago about the decision about the forward land forces component, for which Sweden will be the framework nation. I think this work is happening now day by day, and it is happening really, I think, on a real purposeful basis. I see, Finland's former ambassador to NATO here in the crowd. There's been tremendous work happening in Brussels. The pace of decision making, I think, has been quite impressive in terms of the shift we've seen here when it comes to European security broadly considered, but as well with respect to thinking about the way ahead on Arctic security.
And you mentioned this, Alex, a bit. I mean, we can't talk about the Arctic without talking about the environmental situation. And I just looked up what the latest report was, and NASA just said last week that the sea ice retreated to near historic lows, and they believe it's at its minimum for the year on September 11th, so just within the last couple of weeks. And so this increases dramatically the opportunities for the Russian-Chinese cooperation. I mean, perhaps we wouldn't see, we wouldn't see them scaling up so much if they didn't have these environmental opportunities, which are rising dramatically, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly the navigability of the Northern Sea route is changing. Ice is still a very variable environment. So certainly the long historic trends are fairly clear. It's still, as has been mentioned, a very difficult place to operate. I think we've seen some of that this year in terms of the shipping. We've had the first full-size container ship go through basically without a hitch from St. Petersburg to China.
Which couldn't have happened, 20 years
And this is
ago?
not an ice-class vessel, exactly. So,
right.
It's already still taking a risk, but it couldn't have happened. I don't really want to put a date on it. A Maersk ship has gone through, I think, close to a decade ago now. The volume is not close. So, we have to always frame this quite carefully. The Panama Canal, the Red Sea, Suez Canal, the Arctic's not about to displace this, in even a 25-year horizon. But the option is there. The Chinese are seizing it. I think one of the important parts is that the Chinese and the Russians are building the capability, whether it's ports, whether it's ships, etc. The Chinese are building their Arctic fluency. We heard Arctic IQ. This gives them that opportunity to operate in the cold. And this isn't just military. Frankly, it's mostly not military at this stage. It's commercial enterprise. So I would really, add my voice to the A7 cooperation point. I think that's absolutely crucial. And maybe one thing to keep in mind is an overall change in the Arctic. It's not just what's changing between China and Russia. It's our perceptions of Russia in the Arctic, irrevocably changed in 2022. The other Arctic states had really bent over backwards, I think, since 2014 to say, this is a different space. We are cordoning it off. We'll continue to work with you. Our interests, trump the other problems that we have. And that just became a non-sustainable position.
Was that a mistake at the time?
Well, I think 2014, we should have taken the lessons more clearly. And I think you've alluded to it already. Talking about it as a zone of peace, etc. The Russians have been building up their military capacity, even if it's defensive. Again, it speaks to their ability to wage war in the Arctic. And have we been doing the same things? I think we're late to that game.
and bringing in China on this. So I was in Kirkenes about a year ago, and the reason that I was initially there was because there was this Nordic expose of how Russia is using its ships, its fishing ships, to actually do a lot of other things, and then to pull into port in Kirkenes and get repaired and this kind of thing. And one of the shocking things I heard, and I think this came out even in the last couple of weeks in controversy in Norway, was that the port authority in Kirkenes was saying, we want to turn to China. We want this to be open. We're losing business because of Russia, and we're not at war with China. China's not under sanctions. Let's go that direction. So I believe, because I think I talked to Carsten Friis last night, told me that this has now been shut down a bit in Norway, this opportunity. But again, speaking as Japan, and you look at them welcoming even a country which is as well aware, a NATO country like Norway, saying, come on, China, come on through. I mean, how does that make you feel as Japan, and especially as a China specialist in Japan?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to some comments about the China-Russia. And even after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia is very active around Japan in the Far East. So we conducted the scrambling, so Japanese Air Force's scrambling activity. It was 174 times last year. So Russian Air Force is still very active.
Scrambling. You had to scramble 174
against
times.
Russian fighter jets. Last year.
I don't know what the NATO number is, but they have to do it.
And in addition, Russian-China cooperation military cooperation around Japan is still very active. So they are jointly operating naval ship around the Japanese archipelago. In addition, they are flying together to the Alaska. It's of course a part of the United States, and frankly speaking, their cooperation enhancing and their threats are very intimate to us. And outgoing Stoltenberg, General Secretary, he said when he came to Japan last year, he said, so no NATO partner is closer or more capable than Japan. And I'm very grateful for his kind word. But we are still very capable about that. And in that mind, we are going to increase our military budget up to the 2% of the GDP. And in my understanding, it's the standard of the NATO standard. And we are going to become the third largest country in terms of the military budget in a few years. So, yeah, that's
what
why
percentage of GDP? What?
2% of GDP.
2%? Oh, in the next couple of years?
Yeah.
All right, then.
Teri,
yeah, go ahead.
May I interject just briefly here? I know there's a profound understanding of Russia in this room, but especially for our audience online, I just want to kind of weigh in with a little bit of a corrective, in some sense, to this idea that kind of Russia is this sort of 10-foot tall kind of powerhouse. I think that narrative gets propagated in the media because of the very sort of threatening actions that Russia takes, whether it's with respect to the United States or Japan or the Nordic states that we've described here. And yet, Russia has a remarkable... Yeah, perhaps not just in the media, but Russia has a remarkable capacity for self-sabotage. For so long, they had concerns about the enlargement of NATO, and yet it secured the very future it sought to avoid by its actions in Ukraine. And now Finland and Sweden, Finland, of course, with its massive border with Russia, are now inside of NATO. And so, too, we were talking briefly here about what Russia refers to as the Northern Sea Route. I think part of the reason we don't see a more significant uptick in commercial traffic internationally through the quote-unquote Northern Sea Route is because of, again, Russia's threatening posture along the Russian Arctic coastline and the extra legal kinds of requirements it's sought to impose on freedom of navigation along its coastline. It's still in the single digits in terms of any kind of individual states' vessels underway at any given time. Most of the activity we now see in the Russian Arctic is simply Russian tankers moving hydrocarbons down to China. And we should see this not as a kind of great strength, but as the kind of weakness that it is. Russia's activities in the Russian Arctic are predicated on the fact that access to the Arctic and hydrocarbons from the Russian Arctic are one of the very few things Russia can offer to China in exchange for its diplomatic support, its enablement of Russia's actions in Ukraine. So again, I would just underscore that the relationship that Russia has with China right now is a reflection not of its strength, but of its weakness.
Interesting. Yes, and I mean, we did hear that in the morning panel, Henry Foy's very depressing morning panel. There were some reflections of that as well. I want to bring in, did you want to say something? You looked like you might.
Yeah,
and I want to bring in questions from the audience.
Yeah,
so
I'm just thinking about Russia's strength and the kind of different, like if you compare Russia with United States or China, near-Arctic state, like how that differs. And my understanding is that Russia fundamentally has an Arctic identity, which the other countries, Arctic 7 maybe, and some of the stakeholders don't have. And I'm thinking, where is it coming from? And you know, I think it's a combination of different factors. It's the economic factors. Apparently over 20% of Russia's GDP is extracted from the Arctic region. It has the biggest population living in the Arctic than any of the Arctic countries do, over 2 million people. So it's also protecting the rights of those people in the region. And therefore, it wants to posture itself and show that strength in the region. And I think in that sense, I think some of these other Arctic players are still far behind.
Fair enough. Again, in Norway, I know in its national security strategy, literally says it needs to keep these very small northern villages populated. That's part of its security strategy, so that it also has legitimate
Absolutely.
concerns and protection. I mean, not just to counter Russia, but in addition to the other reasons why it needs its population up there. But that's one of the reasons why Kirkenes, was a focus, because you need to keep commercial activity alive there, and that was what they centered on. So it's a difficult situation for those communities in the NATO countries, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this is, when we look at the kind of impact that the current situation has, it has a lot of impact on the local communities as well, the indigenous people, and also other local people that live in those areas, and their relationships have actually changed a lot because of Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine.
At the same time, have these countries been too permissive when you talk about Norway allowing the Russian ships that are fishing ships to dock there, to get repaired there? I mean, they're not just fishing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's dual activity happening, as we say, yeah. Yeah.
And still, do we have any questions? I know people, oh wow, I have a lot. Okay, I will take the two at the front table and then the one back there. We have enough time, we have 35 minutes, so we don't have to group questions yet, and I know I have someone else who wants a question. Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Johanna Ikävalko. I'm the director of the Arctic Center, University of Lapland, and greetings from Rovaniemi,
nice.
Finnish Lapland.
Cool.
Yes.
Thanks for coming down.
I have an invitation and I have a question, but before I actually give either, I would just like to shortly tell where I come from or what I represent. The Arctic Center is a research organization that provides comprehensive understanding of the Arctic, also comprehensive understanding of the security of the Arctic. And we study the climate change. Nobody talks about the climate change too much in the media anymore. Have you noticed that? We study the people. We study the people in the Arctic. We study the everyday life in the Arctic, the businesses in the Arctic, livelihoods in the Arctic. And it's good to remember that here in Scandinavia, the Arctic is quite different from what it is in North America, for example, that we have infrastructure in the entire Scandinavian northern areas. Most people have 5G in their phones wherever they go to, and we have healthcare, education, all that. But now, the current discussions, they seem to concentrate very much, I could actually, Alex, ask you this in Finnish.
Do you speak Finnish, Alex?
Yes, he does. He never reveals it. The current discussions, they seem to concentrate on hard security. I mean, when we're talking about the Arctic, they concentrate on hard security, which is understandable, but it's only one part of the security. They concentrate on business opportunities in the north and unused natural resources, and they forget about everything that I just mentioned, especially as people living in the north, not just indigenous, not belittling the indigenous, but there are also locals like myself and many, many others. So
So you're,
The question is that how much in your work, when you talk about the Arctic IQ, how much in your work do you actually maintain the holistic view of the Arctic? And then the invitation, no matter what you respond, what you reply, the Arctic Center is organizing another Rovaniemi Arctic Spirit Conference in May 2025. And the theme is elements of security. So we are talking about comprehensive, holistic security in the Arctic Spirit in May 2025. And that's in Rovaniemi. Welcome.
Kyllä mä tulen.
Kiitos.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Johanna. And I think, you know, if you actually look at the arc of Arctic studies and security discussions since the late 80s and 90s, the human security, the environmental security, these have been big parts. And what I've noticed working on the field, I mean, it's very hard to talk about even these geostrategic issues without bringing it right back down to the local level. So in the Canadian case, you know, I would say that the majority of Arctic policy, in fact, has been dominated by those questions. If you look at our Arctic and Northern policy framework from 2019, I think it was, you know, really the first, I think, 5 chapters are completely about life in the North, reconciliation, as we call it, you know, so Canada's governments and peoples dealing with, and, you know, dealing with the heritage of colonialism when it comes to the First Nations peoples, and of course then with the Inuit and the other First Nations that live in the far north. So it is very hard to talk about without that. You know, for instance, you find very different stories throughout the Arctic. Like in the Canadian North, there certainly are constituencies within the Inuit community that are very big on dual and multiple use investment in infrastructure. And you're very right to point to the fact that, you know, North American Arctic infrastructure is in many cases, you know, a century behind perhaps. The majority of energy in the Canadian Arctic is generated by diesel generators, right? So if we're talking about climate change and things like that. So, you know, this question, you certainly find quite a bit of keenness to say, okay, if defense investments are going to come in, we may welcome them, you know, into our communities, but we also want to see the, you know, the 5G, the communications, the roads, the water, which is a basic problem in Canada, the service of water to a lot of Indigenous communities. So those questions are never very far away. And I do think in the discussion of geopolitics in general, we always need to remember, you know, it's easy to fall into kind of abstract terms of power. Of course, we're talking about individual people, and about 4 million people, I guess, who live, you know, roughly around the Arctic Circle and north, you know, need to have a say. And it's certainly in Canada's history, maybe I'll just you know, conclude on this, is that, and I think aspects of U.S. engagement in the North American Arctic too, you know, the Inuit and others were largely, I mean, not just ignored, but in fact, adversely affected and had their lifestyle completely altered by being forced into communities, you know, when the radar systems et cetera went in. So there is a discussion that, again, we use this framework in Canada of reconciliation where, you know, treaty rights need to be respected. In many cases, you know, the treaty rights, that's a discussion. It's not an either or. It can be a both and, but it's not even just consultation anymore. It's co-involvement, co-management, co-ownership, you know, that you have to have the Indigenous component of any investment from mining. And I would say that's a geoeconomic factor for us because Canada simply will not be able, and this applies across the whole country, to realize a lot of its natural resource wealth, you know, compete with China on critical minerals, rare earths, without having this powerful, strong internal governance that intimately involves and works with Inuit First Nations communities.
And I recall Justin Trudeau apologizing, didn't he? Apologize to the First Nation?
He has indeed
just in the last couple of years.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's certainly been a centerpiece of his you know, time as Prime Minister, and I think, you know, it's fundamentally changed how, you know, the Conservative Party, you know, we're about to have an election in Canada probably in the next 12 months, maybe sooner. You know, they have a reconciliation policy. Right, so the fabric of discussion on this has changed entirely in the Canadian case. You know, we have many other interesting examples. I mean, Greenland effectively is an Inuit, you know, government within the Kingdom of Denmark. You know, there's the Sami population, the ongoing discussions here. So I think there's quite a few aspects to this, and it's not just local. I mean, I would say that has a geopolitical dimension as well, and that's kind of the back and forth conversation I think that needs to be happening.
Greg and Nero both want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I know we want to get to more questions, but I think this is a really important theme. So first, many thanks for the kind invitation to
Are we
Arctic
going?
Spirits. Yes, we'll have to go.
We'll have to wait.
Book our tickets, I guess, May 2025. But yeah, just want to note up front that our national strategy for the Arctic region obviously puts these issues of climate change in the Arctic front and center, and it's featured quite heavily as well, even in our national defense strategy. Defense capabilities play an important role in terms of monitoring conditions in the Arctic. Both of those documents also have important sections on engagement with indigenous communities and the important role they have to play in terms of security and stability and prosperity, frankly, in the Arctic region, the transpolar Arctic. I will note that even before coming to Stockholm and Helsinki on this trip, I spent something like 10 days traveling around Alaska, having roundtable discussions in far-flung communities to ensure that Alaska Native groups felt like they saw themselves in this new defense strategy for the Arctic and felt like they had an avenue for expressing both their concerns as well as registering opportunities for us to sort of deepen our engagement across Alaska. And this is very much, front and center, of course, in our bilateral dialogue with our Canadian colleagues. And I will note that issues related to the interests of the Sami people and the Lapland region more generally came up in virtually every meeting I had with Finnish counterparts during my visit here. So I think far from being forgotten, these issues are actually remarkably centered even in defense thinking these days. So hopefully that provides you some assurance that these matters are not being forgotten.
And Greg, just quickly, was there a big difference between, I believe this new strategy replaced a 2018 or 2019 one. Did you see a big difference? Like, did you see a greater understanding, a greater recognition? Has there been, a quick, has there been a quick reckoning of perhaps less attention before in the new strategy? Could you see a big difference?
Yeah, I will say in many respects, I think from the 2019 strategy, this strategy is different in kind, not merely in degree. And there's a lot, including the focus on some of these concerns, that is different from the 2019 strategy. The 2019 strategy was in fact a response to a reporting requirement from Congress. This is a much more proactive strategy signed out by the Secretary, and it's going to bear with it a much more kind of active posture, not only about these issues, but of course our defense engagement with the Arctic 7 and NATO around Arctic matters. So yeah, I think this strategy is much more active, and it's a reflection of the fact that while I think even 5 years ago there was still this idea that the Arctic region was somehow exceptional and that contagion from other parts of the world wouldn't affect the Arctic region and that it would somehow be peaceful in perpetuity in this kind of self-perpetuating way. I think we know now, and we are clear-eyed about the fact that it's going to take active engagement, it's going to take investment, resourcing in the Arctic to ensure it does remain a peaceful, stable, and increasingly prosperous region.
You wanted to comment,
Yeah.
and deterrence and defense.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, thank you for the questions, brilliant question. Obviously, I approach often from the hard security perspective, being a researcher on that regard. But I think you're completely right pointing out that we really need to also address those softer security concerns. We're talking about holistically, when we talk about even total defense or total comprehensive security, two sides of the same coin. And, when you think of the Arctic and the environmental impacts, there are so many issues that we need to address. However, personally, I'm trying to get more engaged. This is not a paid ad, but I'm just pointing out that Welle, the Finnish broadcasting company, for instance, is organizing an event on security. This November, I'm going to be speaking there and hopefully engaging, and I will be engaging with the local people as well, because this is something really important. And you said about the DCA. I was actually speaking in an event this summer, and somebody asked me there, how have the indigenous people's rights, the Sami people's rights, been taken into account in preparation of this agreement? And well, I wasn't speaking on the government's behalf, but I had studied that agreement and the proposal, and I couldn't say.
Exactly. I was just going to say, I have no idea.
So I think this is something that we need to learn from the Canadian and American allies. Yeah.
But the DCA was so uncontroversial in Finland compared to Sweden.
Yeah.
I'm sure that the Swedish government was criticized for this, and we probably could learn from their discussion on this, because that was really hotly debated there. And Masatoshi, you wanted to say something, and then we'll...
Yeah, just briefly, but I'm very happy to hear from Lapland, and I really enjoyed my trip to Lapland 2 years ago, and I'd like to say that there is an outstanding cooperation between your university and Hokkaido University in Japan, and research collaboration. And I'd like to echo with Greg's previous comment. I mean, you mentioned freedom of navigation. So as a member of G7, Japan, alongside with Canada and the US, Japan is putting a much barrier on the freedom of navigation, and it must be adapted in the Arctic as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, General Hodges? Oh, and then there's my Bering Strait question I was looking for.
Ben Hodges, my question is to Director Pollock. And by the way, thank you for the clarification about Russian vulnerabilities in the north, which Teri dismissed as interesting, but I thought it was a very clear and strong statement. My question to you is about Iceland and Svalbard. It feels like our presence in Iceland is growing again, more capacity there, but what about Chinese presence there, diplomatic, economic, scientific in Iceland? And then Svalbard, of course, part of our belongs to our Norwegian allies, but what's our interest watching what Russia is doing in Svalbard?
Yeah, so first, General Hodges, just want to thank you for your leadership, both in uniform and now out of uniform. You've been a strong and passionate advocate, I think, for our engagement in Ukraine, and I really want to associate myself with your remark yesterday that nobody has the right to be fatigued besides the Ukrainian people. So just wanted to kind of thank you for that. So on Iceland and Svalbard, Iceland, it is, I think, somewhat unfortunate that, as you know, the U.S. military kind of retrograded from Keflavik some years ago. This is, as ever, kind of a reflection of competing global interests and the constant kind of challenges of making our resources, our means stretch across all of our respective global commitments. But the engagement with Iceland is growing increasingly robust. As you know, Iceland doesn't have a full-blown military, but nonetheless, we have strong engagement with them. In fact, we've established recently an Arctic security policy roundtable to kind of complement the work happening through the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, as well as the Arctic CHODs, which are meeting here in Reykjavik for long. Reykjavik will also be hosting our next Arctic Security Policy Roundtable. So this is a testament to, I think, Iceland's kind of keen engagement on the security issues with the United States, and they're obviously an important part of the Arctic 7, and they have critical geography. One kind of key theme in all of my meetings, both in Stockholm and here in Helsinki, is the degree to which Northern Europe has kind of become this sort of unified theater. Once upon a time, I think we thought about the Baltics over here, the Arctic over there, the GI-UK gap over there. I think more and more we're seeing through fora like our Arctic fora, as well as through the Nord-Balts format and others, we're seeing more integration and coherence in terms of our posture, our presence, are exercising across that wider region. So Iceland's going to be a key player here moving forward. Svalbard, as you know, is a kind of complex, has a complex history associated with it. I think the Norwegians are clear-eyed about the risks in terms of foreign activity in Svalbard, and I think that's a pattern that we're seeing across the region here, both with respect to Russia, and I think to a real meaningful degree, we're seeing an uptick in concern and skepticism about Chinese intentions. The Chinese have been knocking on doors across the Arctic for a number of years now.
Dropping anchors in unusual places.
Yeah, and they've tried to make a push in various places, particularly in Greenland at one point. And I think this gets to the point that Eero made about Arctic literacy. I think there's a growing understanding that China's intentions in the Arctic may not really align with those of the West. When it comes to the kind of Russian activity in Svalbard, obviously that's something that's a kind of constant irritant diplomatically to the Norwegians as well. But I'm pretty confident in Norway's ability to continue monitoring that activity and take the necessary precautions. Of course, Norway has been in NATO for a very long time. And they're a terrific kind of ally, and I think now that we have the clarity across the Nordic states working together, that's only going to enhance information sharing and the ability to prevent undue influence in places like Svalbard and elsewhere.
Okay, I'm going to take the question from the back. Someone had, okay, and then I'll come back here to the front.
Thank you very much. Fascinating to follow this discussion on the Arctic and the Arctic Council.
And could you introduce yourself, please?
Being my country's representative
Sorry.
in the Arctic Council.
Sorry, great.
I'm Finland's Arctic ambassador.
Fantastic.
2 points. I think it would be useful always to take a step back and note that the Arctic is not from the Arctic Ocean to the Baltic Sea. It's from Vancouver to Vladivostok, including the Central Arctic Ocean and the North Pole. 40% of Canada is Arctic. 100% of Finland is Arctic on the basis of our own national Arctic strategy. So maintaining the comprehensive picture of the circumpolar Arctic is very important. And I submit 2 clarifications with regard to the reflections that the distinguished panelists put forward. One is that Russia has not been suspended from the Arctic Council. Russia continues to be a member in the Arctic Council. Admittedly, we are far from business as usual, but certain work is being taken forward. And thank you very much to the skills of the Norwegian chairship. And we look forward to the Kingdom of Denmark assuming the chairship next May. The Arctic Council is and continues to be of importance. The second clarification I'd like to submit is that I often hear the phrase that the Arctic Council does not deal with security issues. In fact, what the Ottawa Declaration from '96 says is that the Arctic Council shall not address issues pertaining to military security. But there are a whole range of issues related to food, health, environment, and human security that the Council does address. We have a working group on emergency prevention, preparedness and response. We have a legally binding agreement on search and rescue, which even has an expert group addressing issues pertaining to radiation risks. We have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. We have the University of the Arctic Network, which brings together 200 universities in 14 countries that address issues within 60 thematic networks. Many of these address aspects of security.
Ambassador, if I might,
So
I didn't
question,
understand that
but
the Arctic Council had suspended Russia, but that it had suspended its normal meetings for the time being. Is that not correct?
If I was there, I could provide a full account of what the decisions that were taken in the context of the Arctic Council since February of 22 and where we currently are. I don't think I have time or luxury to do that.
No, we've
now.
only got 15
Virtual
minutes.
meetings at low expert level take place.
Okay.
It takes a few more words to explain that, but it has not been suspended. That's the point.
Okay. I checked that this morning, and then I must have read something that wasn't correct. I didn't understand that they had suspended Russia, though, surprisingly. Okay, that's not a question, but thank you for your clarifications. And we have another question here at the front.
Thank you, Jan Willem Röper, Germany. My question is not regarding Bering Strait. My question is, my question is regarding the Arctic 7. We talk so normally about Arctic 7, and there's someone else. There's Russia, and there's going a lot on in Russia. They approaching Faroe Islands, for example, the fishing grounds over there. We saw them in Svalbard. I don't like to continue because you did a fabulous job explaining us what's going on there. And we see the Chinese doing a lot of things, or try to do a lot of things, for example, in Greenland. So my question is, do we already have an ice curtain, or do we or not? I would really help me, please enlighten me. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I don't mind taking a shot
Okay.
at that as my microphone's still working there. An ice curtain is an interesting formulation. We're always looking for good metaphors for this. I think even going back to the Finnish ambassador's comments, I mean, obviously, the situation on diplomacy is very complicated with, frankly, I hear a lot of different statements about how functional the Arctic Council is depending on perspectives.
Thanks.
The issue of China's interests, have not gone away. Just as every country, I think, is facing, the universities, the research, the questions of where can you, de-risking what is left if you de-risk versus decoupling, what's that gray space in between. I think in the case of a place like Greenland, we've largely seen the Chinese fail and be excluded. But they're a factor, right? And just because some mining investments, some airport investments have been, thwarted, doesn't mean they're going to stop and never come back, right? So I think this question of, the communities, the Faroe Islands, places that depend on single resources, that don't have the luxury of choice, they don't have multiple FDI flows, just as China operates in the Pacific Ocean, it has the option for investment. And, Canadian North, it's not much different. At one time, Alaska was actually quite forward on its China policy. So, again, some of the Danish researchers have talked about this as kind of a wait and see approach. I think the conditions for China to have any significant involvement, it was mentioned, if you look at all the Nordic security services, they talk about China as a risk for technology. Some are quite specific about threat to the high north. China finds it a difficult environment to operate in. Mining investments are a big deal, a lot of money up front. If they fall apart, it's a lot of wasted time and potentially a massive hit to your bottom line. But the persistence, I think, is an issue. It was said earlier about Russia in one of the earlier panels. These aren't issues that are just going to be solved. The Arctic is a part of the world, and it has needs, many, the capital, et cetera, that's required to develop it, to deal with issues like climate change come from the outside, and the Chinese are very willing to offer that. So we need to think hard about geoeconomics and the sort of offer, and I think the EU, again, to use the Greenland example, both the EU and the United States have attempted to put good offers on the table so that Greenland can say, yeah, we can continue to develop our economy without the Chinese. But right now, something like 98% of Greenland's earnings come from selling fish, and over 50% of those, if I recall, go to China. So it's, they're there.
That's big.
Really briefly here. So Russia is, of course, an important Arctic state. It is the largest Arctic state. It has legitimate interests, both economic and security, in the Arctic. I think we grant all of that. That said, to the extent that it wants to engage on Arctic matters or on other issues, it needs to change its policies, and the onus is on Russia to end its brutal further occupation of Ukraine. That's step one. Until those actions are kind of underway, I don't really see how we can engage the Russian Federation on parts of the world where there are these kinds of, whether it's shared or competing interests. That said, I will just note that times change, and in sort of strategic time, I think here about the fact that a U.S. representative is up here on a panel with a Japanese representative talking about Arctic security. There are various parts of that sentence that would have been unthinkable, a few decades in the rearview mirror. And so times do change, and that we, look forward to the time when engagement with the Russian Federation on, constructive shared interest is possible once again. But we are extraordinarily far from that point right now, as various other speakers and other panels have underscored through the course of this forum.
Can I just come in very quickly on that point, because I wanted to get to it about Japan and others. The Arctic for Canada kind of extremely, and I think for the United States, for a long time was a very exclusive North American issue under the NORAD construction of aerospace defense that evolved a little bit over time to have more of a maritime, but it still remains an aerospace function. Canada, has historically been very, very cautious about how it engages non-Arctic states, in the region. Our newest defense strategy actually puts that aside, endorses northern flank. I mean, things that would have been quite unthinkable, I think, before 2022. It was always a bit of an issue, but how we approached the North in a NATO framework. I think some of it, certainly if you look at Canadian strategy, and I sense this in the US DoD as well, that the idea that partnerships, that this isn't just an exclusive space. The A7, as was said, if Russia wants to change how it behaves internationally, comes back in, will still set a lot of the terms for what sort of engagement and involvement, but the opportunities for Germany, the opportunities for Japan, the opportunities for the NATO alliance in general, I think are much bigger. And the potential is there for creativity. And we've seen some of that, for instance, with the trilateral letter of intent between Canada, Norway, and Germany on maritime security in the North Atlantic. We're seeing ways that if you're outside of the region, you can get involved, and that's a change among how we're thinking about, Arctic.
Reflected in NATO as well, in its increasing
Absolutely.
cooperation with Indo-European. And Masatoshi, you wanted to say something, and
Yeah.
then I'll take two questions together. We're not going to have. We only have 8 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, just briefly, and I'd like to agree with the Finnish ambassador, and the discussion should be comprehensive. And I'd like to add the infrastructure that was discussed on the stage yesterday. And Japan is very active contributor about infrastructure in Asia as well. So about the high loads airport and ports, and it could be a potential contribution from Japan as well in the Arctic. Yeah.
Okay. All right. This lady and behind you. I'll take those two together, and we'll have very short. We'll need to have quite short answers here. It's very, Ben, I remember you saying yesterday how hard it is to see from here. It's very hard, so I apologize.
Hello, my name is
Wendy.
Amelia. I'm with the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I wanted to pick up on Alex's point there on cooperation and different opportunities, because of course the Warsaw format exists as a place for observer states and the European Union to meet annually, meet with the chairpersonship and talk about working groups. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask whether there were any opportunities to formalize the Warsaw format and that cooperation and be able to take some of the conversations from that, very frank conversations that exist among the observer states, take those forward into the Arctic Council, sort of bearing in mind what the ambassador mentioned with this very broad consideration of security. Thank you.
Okay, and a question behind you.
My name is Fredrik Löjdqvist. I'm director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. The title of this session is Securing the Arctic, and I'm still not quite sure what exactly we're securing. I would propose one interest that we have in securing the Arctic, and that is upholding international law, which Russia clearly is challenging in terms of how it's defined territory and economic zones and so forth, and freedom of navigation. Normally, it seems that Russia is having the initiative and we're reacting, but in the Arctic, I'm not even sure that we're even reacting. How can we sort of address this challenge? And clearly, military security is back, and if the Arctic Council is not the forum to discuss this, where do we discuss military security in the Arctic?
Okay, I mean, I think those are both questions that can, especially the last one, can provide a good basis for concluding remarks from each of the speakers as well. And I mean, talking about whether there's any choice but to increasingly militarize in the Arctic under the current conditions with Russia, I mean, I think also is a look forward. So, Iro, I will start with you. And again, we have 5 minutes, so
Yes.
will be your concluding remarks.
Yes,
as well.
thank you so much. I'm kind of tying with the previous question we had in the previous round. I think there is ice curtain currently, and there will be ice curtain as long as the war in Ukraine continues. And once that melts, that curtain will come down. But it will take time. And this brings to the next point that we need to form an strongly cooperate with the countries who share the same norms and values with us within the rules-based international order, within the Arctic 7, the Arctic stakeholders like the IP4 countries in the Indo-Pacific, Japan. So I think this is really important. Upholding the kind of format of fora that we could have for military security in the Arctic, as far as I see, there's only one. That's NATO. Why take it anywhere else? We have NATO's new DDA at place. We have NATO's new regional plans at place. We do all the military exercises, command control, increasing Arctic capabilities. Maybe one day in NATO we will see actually Arctic capabilities. There will be a snowflake next to a capability requirement in NATO's defense planning process.
Well, there are new regional plans, and we don't know exactly what's in them. But
so yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay. Greg?
Yeah, so I think I delineated earlier some of the fora that we're currently engaging in terms of Arctic security, but want to associate myself with Eero's remark that, first and foremost, it's going to be NATO. That's really going to be the sort of top of the list in terms of thinking about Arctic security matters. Whether there will be more NATO in Arctic remains to be seen, but now with Finland and Sweden, there is by definition, more Arctic in NATO. And I think that's a positive development. Obviously, Finland and Sweden bring tremendous Arctic capabilities and defense capabilities writ large. But there are other bodies that will feed into the dialogue that happens within Brussels. I mentioned some of our Arctic 7 mechanisms, in particular our emerging Arctic Security Policy Roundtable. Our next, I think, engagement will be convened by the Norwegians and then in person in Iceland here before long. We've got the Arctic CHODs, of course, ongoing. Next meeting in the Chiefs of Defense meeting in Reykjavik. I think that's an important bit of connective tissue. And then the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which extends beyond the Arctic 7 and gets to some of these issues of partnership beyond the Arctic states. I also think I mentioned the Nordic defense cooperation mechanisms. And then finally, of course, there's still tremendous amounts of bilateral engagement across the Arctic 7 and beyond. I do want to kind of put one footnote on all of that while our strategy underscores the importance and value of expanding engagement and partnership on Arctic security beyond the A7, there are certain sovereign rights and responsibilities when it comes to the Arctic. And I think the Arctic 7 are going to protect those, both as individual nation states as well as a group of Arctic nations. I think there are intentions by some to try to create a narrative that the Arctic is a kind of global commons and that the Arctic should be internationalized. And I think that's a conception that we would have real concerns about and need to guard against. So there's an important balance to be struck here.
So you won't be inviting Indo-European CHODs to the Arctic CHODs meeting?
Not at this time.
Interesting. Okay.
Alex? We talk about the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic, is an ocean and then a lot of recognized territory for sovereign countries. So in a sense, like a lot of the structure is there. The Antarctic, completely different story. To add that, in terms of international law, Canada has competing or, likely be shown to have competing continental shelf claims in the Arctic Ocean with both the Russian Federation and potentially with the Kingdom of Denmark. Canada and the United States have just struck a committee to resolve our ongoing border marine delimitation issues in the Beaufort Sea. So international law is still playing a large role. I think most people say that the Russians will still, use international law there. I'd be inclined to agree. But, when we talk international law with the Russians, they need to know that we're serious about security of this region ourselves and we've taken the appropriate measures. Militarization of the Arctic, I think, is a careful word we have to be careful about. We have every right to put our militaries there and strengthen them. If you look at the details of pretty much what certainly Canada and the United States and most of the others, it's about awareness. It's about, creating the awareness in the region about what's going on. That's backed up by capabilities, but a lot of it is understanding better the space. And again, that's a completely consistent point with international law and any understanding of sovereignty. Maybe a final point on getting involved. This is a big question, I think. Countries like Japan have three adversaries right next door, but are large countries that can contribute. South Korea is another one. Germany, France, the UK are clear countries that can be involved. For a country like Poland, I think there'd be opportunities to learn, but of course Poland probably has to anchor the Eastern Front. So I think these are the conversations that need to continue about, creatively, where does this meet our interests? It's not just getting involved with the Arctic for getting involved with the Arctic. The A7, I think, should lead those discussions, but I think there's more creative opportunity. I'll leave it there.
Sorry, I meant to say Indo-Pacific, not Indo-European, but I'm wondering then, is what you've heard here today as Japan, is this reassuring enough for you? You won't be included in all Arctic configurations, but certainly more than would have happened, and perhaps even Russia's war on Ukraine has increased the opportunities for Japan. But are these some ideas that reassure Japan that China is not going to, China and Russia are not going to be able to just completely take over this area and your interests there?
First of all, I'd like to resonate with Eric's international law, and especially the UNCLOS is very vital to Japan as a maritime nation. And in addition, I'd like to, as Ira said, as a member of IP4, we'd like to enhance our cooperation with NATO. And
I tried to get you invited to the Arctic Chods, but
and we are very still interested in hosting a liaison office in Tokyo. So I'm not sure about the internal discussion within the NATO, but anyway, we'd like to host it. And in addition, we are going to increase our military budget, but it's actually we are a military power. So a lot of people regard Japan as the soft power. Something like the manga or sushi, but it's reality that we are still a military power as well. So and on your side, not on the other side. So we'd like to suggest you to utilize Japanese power, so especially for the European security. Thank you.
I would have liked us to be able to go into also what happens after the next U.S. elections. Let's hope that this strategy stays online after November, whatever, actually after January. I mean, there's a lot of potential concern about what could happen with the progress that's been made on this, but we didn't have time. But I now need to wrap up our panel. Thank you very much to FIIA for having me again back, always a pleasure, and our panelists here. And to all of you, I mean, we have a full room. For those of you online who can't see, we have a full room here and lots of engagement, and that's really a compliment to you, FIIA, and it makes it much more enjoyable for us. And now I am going to hand this over to Mikael to wrap up HSF 2024. Thank you so much to everyone here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Guess we will exit right.
That was lovely.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks. Wow. These past 3 days have been pretty intense, and as Teri just said, we still have most of the people actually in the room, which is pretty incredible after such an intense 3 days of debate. Unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end, as you know. Although I'm a bit partial, I guess, to this, I would say that this year's Helsinki Security Forum has, if possible, been even better than the previous 2 editions. And this would not have been possible without the support of our partners and our sponsors, which there are many more than there have been in the past 2 editions. We have the partners that we have had previously, the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have the Finnish Ministry of Defense, who supported the forum, the City of Helsinki and Mayor Juhana Vartiainen. We have, in addition, also some corporate sponsors. We have Patria, Fortum, Lockheed Martin, IQM, and also the Hybrid Center of Excellence. So please give our partners and sponsors a big hand of applause. Thank you. And you have been a great and very engaged audience with lots of excellent questions. So I think this is the right time also for you to thank yourself and for me to thank you. Thank you very much for being around and asking so many good questions. Now, at FIIA, we often say that we have a very special FIIA spirit. Many of us are long-timers who have been in the house many times for very many years, or come back to FIIA. And it's a bit hard to say why we have this great spirit, but for as long as I can remember, at least since the 90s, it's been there. And I think that some of this FIIA spirit has actually rubbed off also on the Helsinki Security Forum. There's something special about the debates we have here. Even though the issues that we debate are often serious, sometimes even grim, we still manage to talk about them in a spirit of collegial and mutually respectful manner, which is actually quite a feat in these days that are so divisive in international politics. And President Stubb, during the first day, his interview with Henry Foy, I think was very much sort of setting the tone for this year's Helsinki Security Forum in this very pleasant kind of talking about some very serious issues. And of course, off stage as well, we have had many good encounters, good debates. I've learned a lot during these days. I hope many of you have as well. And we have also, of course, gotten to know each other better during these days. So I hope that many of you will be back again in next year's Helsinki Security Forum, 4th edition. Now, anyone who has ever worked on organizing a large conference knows that there's a lot of work that goes into something like this. A lot of the work is invisible. You don't notice it. And in fact, many of the best arranged conferences are the ones where you don't really notice the arrangements because everything just flows smoothly and everything just works. And I think this has been also something that in all 3 editions of Helsinki Security Forum has been there. It's just worked, and it's kind of become a signature feature of a conference. And I think that's very fitting, actually, for a conference that has debated a whole of society approach to security, where every part sort of fits together and works well together. So on this note, I would like to conclude the official part of a Helsinki Security Forum. Thank you all once again, and hope to see you again next year. Thank you.